Welcome to the Rural Opportunities Podcast. This week I talked to Mackenzie Brown from Indigenous Tourism Alberta. Indigenous Tourism Alberta, or ITA, is a non-profit organization devoted to grow and promote authentic, sustainable, and culturally rich Indigenous tourism experiences. Mackenzie is a First Nations Cree woman from the Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation. She has a background as a performer, drummer, tourism entrepreneur, philanthropist, and an advocate for at-risk youth within the Edmonton area. She is a very accomplished woman, and we are grateful for this conversation and this opportunity to learn more about Indigenous tourism in Alberta. Read Mackenzie's full bio in the description. I hope you enjoy this conversation. So welcome to the Rural Opportunities Podcast. I'm excited to have you on here.
I'm excited to be here, honestly.
Yeah, this is pretty fun. So I wanted to start off by sharing a couple stats from your website because I think it's cool how much Indigenous tourism contributes to Canada. So the 2015 National Aboriginal Tourism Research Project measured the economic impact of Indigenous tourism in Canada as 33,100 workers employed, 2.65 billion of gross output, 1.4 billion GDP, 870 million in wages and salaries, and 67 million of consumption tax revenue. That's not just small potatoes. That's quite significant.
Oh, absolutely. It's, Indigenous tourism is actually the fastest growing industry within Alberta. It is way exceeding, both forestry and the oil and gas industry sector. And yeah, it's not a small feat. It contributes a ton. And we've actually found in 2019 there was a study that went out, and there's about 160 Indigenous tourism businesses across Alberta, which is huge.
Wow, yeah. That's amazing. So how did ITA get started?
So Indigenous Tourism Alberta, we got created in 2018, and it really came from it came from a need to have an organization that specified in the growth of Indigenous tourism. And when we look at, economic development from an Indigenous lens, the way that you develop these experiences and these businesses tends to be a little bit different from when you're doing business development with non-Indigenous peoples. So yeah, that's really where it was created from. We had the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada actually came down and held their International Indigenous Tourism Conference in Calgary. And that was when it was identified that there needed to be a provincial marketing organization and development organization specifically for the growth of Indigenous tourism in Alberta. And then that was when ITA was born.
That's amazing. So how does Indigenous Tourism Alberta, how does having that specifically for Indigenous people make a difference for the Indigenous tourism operators and for people experiencing Indigenous tourism?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important because a lot of times Indigenous tourism deals with culture. And when you are dealing with culture, it's incredibly important that that is led by Indigenous people and supported by settlers. And so it's really important that we have an organization such as ITA that is Indigenous led. We are 100% Indigenous led. Our board of directors are all Indigenous tourism operators, actually, which is fantastic.
That's amazing.
And majority of our staff is Indigenous. So that's important because when you're dealing with culture, it's important to have that led by Indigenous people. Indigenous Tourism Alberta, a lot of our programs as well, we have, for example, like a community tourism readiness program that works with nations and Métis settlements on developing tourism that's community led. And we don't see that a ton in non-Indigenous communities. So that's something that is specific. Same with the idea of, we have cultural awareness programs that we have created. We have our entrepreneurship programs that a bulk amount of time is spent on the idea of authenticity and protocol. So yeah, that's just really how ITA kind of steps in and how we help grow Indigenous tourism, because again, as I had mentioned, there are different aspects, and it's important that that the growth of Indigenous tourism is helped by an Indigenous-led organization.
Mm-hmm. Is there different barriers that Indigenous people face when they're starting a tourism organization?
That's a great question. I actually wrote an entire blog on that, because yeah, we do find that there are some unique barriers. Depending on, so some of the unique barriers revolve around location. You know, there are some unique barriers if you are on your reserve or your settlement starting up a business. There's different access to funding as well if you're an Indigenous entrepreneur. And then we also find a lot of barriers in just marketing. Actually, marketing can be a really huge barrier for a lot of Indigenous entrepreneurs starting off. For one, it is literally encoded in our cultural teachings to be humble. And so sometimes people find marketing to be really difficult. Access to internet, you know, a lot of I was actually trying to do I was doing an entrepreneur workshop yesterday, and one of our amazing speakers couldn't access the platform because she lives on Kainai Reserve, you know, and there's not very great internet there. So we see these kind of unique barriers depending on location. Also, we have something called the moccasin telegraph. So that means that information really gets passed down orally, as we've seen in history as well. And so to take that and try to switch it to something that has more of an online presence for other people to be aware of these tourism endeavors can be a little bit of a difficulty for our entrepreneurs. So that's also when we come into play, you know, trying to bridge that barrier, bridge that gap.
That's awesome. So is Indigenous Tourism Alberta partnered with Travel Alberta, or is it completely separate?
So we are separate entities, but we have a partnership with one another because both of us are in the tourism space. Both of us support one another. And so, yeah, we get funding from Travel Alberta. We get a ton of support from Travel Alberta. They're really great partners of ours.
On your website, one thing that I thought was really interesting is that people are now looking for transformative travel experiences. And like it started out as destination, then it was kind of like they wanted to learn something new, and now it's transformative. So how is Indigenous tourism a part of that? And how is that a big piece of Indigenous tourism?
Yeah, it's so interesting, like, because tourism itself has its own trends. And we've seen it really change, especially with the growth of social media. Actually, that was really when destinations became a thing, you know, hotspot travel. People were posting all these awesome photos on their Instagram, and then other people wanted to go there to get the best Instagram photo. It's really interesting the way that tourism trends come into play. But yeah, we're seeing now transformative. So that means that people want to go and they want to experience an experience that is completely going to change the way that they even think about themselves, the way that they think about themselves, the way that they think about the world. This is great for Indigenous tourism. And the reason why this is great is because Indigenous peoples, we are natural storytellers and have an inherent connection to the earth and to the land itself. And that can be a very transformative experience for a lot of people who grew up in the cities or don't have that kind of connection to the land. You know, we see the land as a relative. And when you start to view the world that way, it really changes the way that you end up thinking. So that's really exciting. A lot of Indigenous tourism is based from the land. Most of our operators take people out on the land, show them different teachings and that interconnectedness to one another. And people are really craving that. We're seeing, especially with the pandemic going on, everybody's connected to the computer, but we're not necessarily connected to ourselves and the greater Mother Earth, so to say. So yeah, people are really looking for that transformative experience, and Indigenous tourism does end up picking a lot of those boxes for a lot of travelers.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you mentioned the pandemic. What are some of the challenges and opportunities that have come with the pandemic? Obviously, as tourism, it was hit quite hard.
Yeah, so yeah, the tourism industry was definitely hit really hard, especially because, a lot of Indigenous tourism does rely on international travelers. But the good thing is some research in 2019 showed that actually 1 in 4 domestic travelers are looking for an authentic Indigenous tourism experience. So that means, 25% of Canadians want to experience an authentic Indigenous experience. So that's a huge opportunity. With the barriers of not being able to gather, but then being able to gather outside. Indigenous tourism's pretty inherently land-based. And so a lot of our operators have been able to really pivot. As well, Indigenous tourism tends to be smaller, more intimate experiences, which again is perfect in light of COVID, just because we do have to be careful. We have to have those smaller group sizes. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunity. People are trying to explore their backyard in a new way. And a lot of the stories and a lot of the history of our backyard hasn't been told. And so it's an exciting time for people to get to know the land that they've been on and that they live in, but from the eyes of an Indigenous tourism operator.
For sure. I think the first time I encountered Indigenous tourism was in the Yukon, because I think
amazing.
they do a really good, it's just kind of incorporated into everything. Like every museum that we went to had the Indigenous story as a part of it. And it was just kind of a piece of everywhere that we went, which was kind of cool. So I haven't ever been on like an Indigenous tour or anything like that specifically. But that's kind of the first time that I started thinking differently, because they had stories of like when they started Dawson City and they're like, oh, we actually want to be here to pan for gold. So they moved Indigenous people out. And then they're like, oh, actually, we want that area too. So we're going to move you again. And then, oh, actually, we want where we moved you to. So we're going to move you again. And I was like, what? Like, oh, and yeah, so that's the first time I started thinking about that differently, because I hadn't ever come in contact with that information. You know what I mean? And then to like be standing where that happened.
Yeah. I think, the beautiful thing, like there are so many beautiful things about Indigenous tourism. For one, like economic benefits aside, it is a way of cultural reclamation. A lot of people are able to reclaim their culture. They're able to live in their traditional ways while making a living off of that. And then one of the amazing benefits that we see, as you've experienced, is telling the truth in an unapproachable way. So many people seek out Indigenous tourism experiences just to learn more about Indigenous peoples. And that's a huge opportunity for us as Indigenous peoples, because we get to then tell our own story, right? We get to rewrite what may have been said or may not have been said. And yeah, that's really exciting. It gives us back the power of our own voices.
For sure. Do you have a favorite story or experience of Indigenous Tourism Alberta?
Oh, that is a great question. Honestly, we have so many experiences that are just so exciting. You've spoken to Métis Crossing. I absolutely love Métis Crossing. They're creating a new dark sky experience, which I'm super
Ooh.
excited about because my mom actually, she has a business called Warrior Women down in Jasper, and she also does dark sky story experiences. So I'm really excited to hear from a Métis perspective because we're Cree.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Down in the south, there's some really awesome experiences such as drift out west fly fishing.
Mm-hmm.
Quinn is his name, and he actually takes you down the Bow River, like in Calgary, to go
Mm-hmm.
fly fishing. And so for a lot of people like who might not have ever been on the Bow River, that's something really exciting for them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have painted warriors and Mohegan trails over in Sundre that do archery, medicine walks. You know, they can take you out to the Grotto Canyon and show you some of the pictographs that are over there too, which is also really special. Um, and then we also have experiences up north too. You know, a lot of dark skies, a lot of northern lights. We have ice fishing shacks up
Mm-hmm.
there on the Slave Lake area, Bannock Bed and Inn, which is an amazing little kind of bed and breakfast place. Yeah, and even in Sir Winston Churchill in Lac La Biche, you can do teepee comfort camping down
Mm-hmm.
there as well. So honestly, like there's so much. And it ranges from, you know, one of our members is an ice climber and a rock climber
Wow.
out in Nordegg and can take you out rock climbing. And then we
Mm.
have hikers and guides and plant walks and our museums and our resorts and our casinos and our culinary experiences too. Yeah, it's really special to work in an industry that is touched by so many other industries
Mm.
and really encompasses so many different ways of life.
Mm. That's cool. It sounds like Indigenous tourism is all year round. Any time of the year that you want to experience Indigenous tourism, you can. There's something out there.
100%. We're actually coming out with a blog here really soon on like winter experiences
Mm.
because yeah, it doesn't stop. And something that's so special is a lot of times our operators really follow their traditional ways. So you know, wintertime was a time for storytelling and it was also a time for trapping.
Mm.
So we have full experiences that follow the trap line, that follow creation stories, dark sky stories for the winter, you know, huddled around a campfire. And then we get into spring and then we get into summer where we have a lot of our hiking guides that come out to play. And then even the fall experiences with the beautiful trees. Yeah, so it is a 100% year-round thing that you can go and take part in.
Mm. That's awesome. So I just realized that I never actually let you talk about your background. So you mentioned that you were Cree. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And
No
like,
worries. I'll introduce myself if that's okay.
yeah,
And then a little bit about how I got into Indigenous tourism. How does that
yeah,
sound?
yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so Tantsay na totamak, kamamak netsigason, Bigitawakanskahigan Ochinia, Amiskwaciwaskahikan Ekonia. Welcome. Hi, my name is Mackenzie. I am originally from Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, but I make Edmonton, Amiskwaciwaskahikan my home now. I've lived here for several years. Um, I I am a Indigenous tourism advocate. I am a drummer, a singer, storyteller, and an artist as well. So I got into tourism at a really young age. I have a business with my mom. We're called Warrior Women. We operate primarily out of Jasper. And so I've been drumming, singing, and storytelling since I was 12, taking it seriously since I was about 15, 16. And every year I'd move back down to Jasper. My mom and I would drum and sing and story tell for big bus tours that came to Jasper Park Lodge. And it was really funny because after I graduated, I actually graduated with my degree in child and youth care services.
Mm.
And after I graduated, I had applied for a job with the government of Alberta working in Indigenous tourism as an Indigenous tourism developer. And I remember my boss telling me on day one how excited he was to have an Indigenous tourism entrepreneur on the team. And I just looked at him and I thought, I'm not an Indigenous tourism entrepreneur. I said, I'm just a storyteller and a singer. And he looked at me and he said, no, you're an entrepreneur. You guys have a business, you make your living doing tourism. And that really opened my eyes. And we actually find that a lot of our operators, before they're connected with us, are working in the tourism industry, but just not realizing it. And you'll hear a lot of nations even say, oh, yeah, we've been doing that for years. We just didn't call it tourism.
Right.
So that's something that's incredibly special. I now work for Indigenous Tourism Alberta as their project manager, and I've been here since June. Prior, as I had mentioned, I worked at the government of Alberta as an Indigenous tourism developer, and then I worked for Explore Edmonton as their Indigenous tourism development specialist. And yeah, now I'm here at ITA.
That's awesome. So with Métis Crossing, we talked a little bit about the culturally distinct pieces of different Indigenous cultures. So what are some culturally distinct pieces of being Cree?
That's a great question. Cree people, we come from the plains, so we are a plains culture. And we have a lot of the cultures in Alberta are plains culture. You know, we have the Blackfoot, even we have the Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda, but we're all different. We all have different cultures, different customs. The Cree people, we are plains. We move nomadically. So we do really follow the 13 moon cycles, and we follow the seasons a lot, because it meant that you typically had a winter camp that you'd move to and a summer camp that you'd go to. There's a lot of similarities to the Métis people, because, you know, Métis people in this particular area, we're really a beautiful marriage of the French and the Cree that came together. So there are a lot of similarities. We, as the same as a lot of Indigenous cultures, we are connected to the land, but our stories are different. Even our medicine wheels are different. So we are also something that's really unique about the Cree people is our language is actually a action-based language, which is really cool. So we are not a noun-based language. So a lot of times, even our stories come from our language, and the way that our language is created comes from different creation stories. So an example of this is from our Cree creation story of how the world came to be. Actually, it's a story about Amiskwaciwaskahikan, a star woman coming down to the earth and creating the people. And so when you look up at the stars, the word for star is Achakosak, but the word for our spirit is Achak, because our spirit literally came from the stars. And so yeah, so we have a lot of our identity is really based around creation stories, which I think is really unique, and then our relationship to the land as well.
Are there some specific plants that are significant to Cree people?
Yeah, definitely. You know, there's my elder was telling me this story the other day. And so depending on where you are, you can be in Cree territory, you can be in Blackfoot territory. And we did have different medicines just because we were typically in different areas. We absolutely had overlap 100%. But yeah, depending on where you are, we will have more knowledge of those particular plants over other plants. You know what, I am not a plant knowledge keeper, so I can't talk about specific plants just because I don't have that awareness, I don't have that knowledge. But I'll share this story that my elder told me. He told me the other day that that a long time ago there was a Blackfoot man, and he was up in Cree territory, and as he was walking across the land, it's customary to talk to the plants in your language. So he was greeting the flowers, he was greeting the wildlife, and he was greeting the trees. And at one point in time, the trees talked back to him, and they told him that they didn't understand because he was speaking Blackfoot and they only knew how to speak Cree. So it's just this beautiful story that depending on where you are, we do believe that your relationship to the land has influenced even the land itself. And so yeah, absolutely, there are Cree medicines, there are Blackfoot medicines, there are overlaps, but there are lots of differences.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to ask because I have a background in environmental stewardship, so we talk a lot about native plants in that. There's in school, there's not really a mention of the connection to Indigenous people, but that's kind of how I think that they know certain plants are medicinal, is because Indigenous people use them. That's just
100%.
Yeah.
There's so much plant medicine, there's even women's medicine, there's men's medicine, there's medicine for your heart. Yeah, it's really like it's amazing. If you ever have the chance to go out with a medicine keeper, somebody like Brenda Holder is a medicine woman with Mohegan Trails, and her entire experiences are around talking about medicines and talking about plant medicines, and even the idea of winter medicines. We have plants that grow in the winter and that are better to be harvested then as well.
That's interesting. One thing I want to ask you, which we've already talked about, but because I'm from Wetaskiwin, I always thought that Wetaskiwin translated to Peace Hills because that's something that's always talked about. But you told me that it translates to something else. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, so Wetaskiwin is a Cree word, and that Cree word actually means to be a good neighbor. Which is beautiful because Wetaskiwin is right close by Amiskwaciwaskahikan, right? When you refer to the Peace Hills is that area, which is near Wetaskiwin, but the Peace Hills is that area where we believe that the Blackfoot and the Cree made peace, because historically we've been at war, we haven't gotten along typically with the Blackfoot people, so that was where we made peace. But yeah, the word Wetaskiwin is a Cree word, and it means to take care of one another, to be a good neighbor.
I love that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
it's amazing. Like oh, sorry, continue.
I like knowing that, and I don't think a lot of people in Wetaskiwin know that, so I think it's really cool, and I think it's a cooler translation than what we all think is Peace Hills. And yeah, I just think it speaks to, like, if you know that translation is to be a good neighbor, to me, it makes me want to be a better neighbor. If that makes sense.
Definitely. No, for sure. Like, it's amazing because we actually have a lot of Cree names. A lot of Cree names, a lot of Blackfoot names within Alberta that people just don't realize. And again, how I had mentioned that a lot of Indigenous language is action based, so they will have meanings behind their name. Even the North Saskatchewan River, Saskatchewan, that comes from a Cree word that means a river that moves at a walking pace.
Mm.
So all of these, so we have these names that have come from Indigenous languages that sometimes have a call to action, that sometimes have a meaning behind them. And it is really unique when you start to learn these different names.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very cool. How can non-Indigenous tourism operators support Indigenous tourism and Indigenous Tourism Alberta?
That's a really good question, because the beautiful thing about the growth of Indigenous tourism is that it takes everybody. We can't live in these silos. We need to work together and grow the industry together. There's a lot of things that we need help on from our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, and then there's a lot of things that our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters can learn from us too. It's a reciprocal relationship. You want things to be a reciprocal relationship. In terms of how to help, there's a ton of partnerships that can happen. We've seen some beautiful partnerships happen. We've seen, one of my favorite partnerships that I've seen happen is in Edmonton, just outside of Edmonton in Bonaccord. There's a beautiful garden called the Prairie Gardens, and they are a farm. And they have this amazing long table dinner series that they do. And they collaborated with Chef Scott Eiserhoff, who is an Indigenous chef, as well as Sissy Thiessen, who is a dancer. And together they put on this incredible event of celebrating Indigenous culinary. And so, Scott and Sissy didn't have an area that they could do this kind of an experience. And Tam from Prairie Gardens said, I have this beautiful garden that you guys can come and participate in. So we've seen some amazing collaborative relationships and partnerships come out from that. We've seen too, people creating kind of like road trips and itineraries that include both Indigenous and non-Indigenous experiences. If you have somebody that's coming down to your experience, invite an artisan or something to come and set up a table, and it really just enhances your experience that you're able to offer. I always suggest, if people want to learn how to create a relationship with one of our operators, reach out to us. Like, most of the time, our entrepreneurs also want to create relationships with you and work together. We're stronger together than we are apart.
Right. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear the story with Tam at Prairie Gardens, because agritourism is something that, because we're an ag society, I think about a little bit more. And if you read into the history of Indigenous people in farming, it's kind of heartbreaking in Alberta and probably across Canada. And so to invite Indigenous people back onto your land, even as farmland, I think is really important. And especially because farmers hold a lot of land under their care. And some of that land is culturally important, even if we might not realize that either, or have significant plants or something like that on it. Do you have any thoughts on agritourism and Indigenous tourism?
Yeah, definitely. Honestly, I feel like you hit the nail on its head, in saying that it's really special for a lot of Indigenous peoples to be back on those particular lands, because a lot of traditional lands were taken away and turned into farming. And I think the thing is too is that farmlands are important to Indigenous people, because it's a way of, again, having a reciprocal relationship with the land, that you take care of the land, and then in return the land gives you a bounty full of beautiful produce. And Indigenous peoples inherently and historically we're farmers. We had our own food systems, our own way of growing crops together. You might hear the story of the three sisters, and the three sisters is the corn, the beans, and the squash, which have scientifically been proven to grow better together than apart from one another. And we knew this, and so we would plant those crops together. So farming is it's in our DNA. It's a way of having a relationship with the land again. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity for agritourism in Indigenous tourism, and a huge opportunity for farmers to work with Indigenous peoples, to help grow their farming and do it in a reciprocal way.
That's cool. Is Indigenous tourism a nonprofit?
We are.
Okay.
Yep. We are a not-for-profit and a membership-based society. So all of the people that we talk about, they are members of ours. Which is awesome.
With Indigenous tourism being a membership-based organization, how can you be a part of that, and what are the criteria for that?
Yeah, so Indigenous Tourism Alberta, we are a not-for-profit and a membership-based society. So our membership consists of those businesses that are 51% Indigenously owned and operated. And then we also have industry partners too. So those are non-Indigenous businesses that want to help support the growth of Indigenous tourism. Right now for 2021, our membership is free. And so if you want to sign up for a membership, you just have to head over to our website, which is www.indigenoustourismalberta.ca, and head to industry. And under industry, you will see membership, and you can apply right online to become one of our members. And you can be a member whether you're in development, whether you are visitor ready, market ready, or export ready. So we take all and everything in terms of growing Indigenous tourism and supporting our members.
Awesome. And I will link your website into the notes. And yeah, I encourage people to check it out. There's some good resources on how to find Indigenous tourism operators, and like a gift guide and all of that cool stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And if you ever venture into our industry resources as well, we have webinars, we have blogs, we have all and everything. It's nice to have a consumer-based website as well as a industry growth website too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for talking to me, Mackenzie, about this. And I just appreciate learning as much as I can about it. And yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, Megan. This has been a incredibly fun morning. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Visit the Indigenous Tourism Alberta website for Indigenous destinations, experiences, and businesses to support this year on your Alberta adventures. Check out episode 6 of the Rural Opportunities podcast to learn more about Métis Crossing. Please follow the Rural Opportunities on your podcast site or subscribe on YouTube. Thank you for listening and supporting the Camrose Regional Exhibition and Agriculture Society.